The photography of Berenice Abbott is extremely complex and beautiful because she goes from portrait photography to documentary photography to science photography and landscape. She dipped her toes in pretty much a lot of different subjects, and she did it, at least in my eyes, very successfully and in a very unique way. And I guess that studying her photography or going through her photography, it's kind of like somebody opened a whole encyclopedia to us and just told us about lines, composition, light, and the importance of light in photography. And so today we're gonna go through the photography of Berenice Abbott, who was an incredible photographer. And without further ado, grab a drink, make yourself comfortable, and let's go straight into the video. Abbott was born in Ohio, but moved to New York in 1918, where she aimed to study sculpture. And while doing it, she met highly influential artists such as Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray. And following the path of many American artists and writers of this period, she too moved to Paris, where she continued her study of sculpture while supporting herself through the many odd jobs she could find. She then traveled to Berlin and returned to Paris in 1923 to become Man Ray's assistant, and while working with him, she learned all the technical sides of photography, becoming an expert in printing. 2 years later, she set up her own studio in Paris, where she photographed famed artists and people from high circles. A year later, after her first show, she had the honor of photographing French photographer Eugène Atget, who had been photographing Paris since the 1890s. She was very impressed and influenced by his work and his style, and committed to spread the word about it, she decided to return to New York City, where she would show his work to artists, friends, and galleries. She arrived in New York in 1929, and of course she kept with her initial idea of showing Atget's work to artists that were her friends, to galleries, etc. And there was one thing though that really impressed her, and she was very much impressed by the city, in this case New York, and how much it had changed. And so she decided to document it and photograph the city. First she did it handheld, and then eventually she progressed into large format photography and capturing the city with an 8x10 field camera. And because her photography was great and it started attracting a lot of attention, she received a grant or sort of financial support that allowed her to continuously photograph the city, put more effort into it. And so she came up with a series of photos of New York, which she titled Changing New York, and that won around 1935 and 1939. These photos have very deep sociological roots, since in a way it's not just about documenting buildings and street scenes, but show how development, and in this case collective human development and behavior, had brought significant changes to the surrounding space. Her photography is very clever in the way that it explores composition and the various elements of composition, such as lines, proportion, and distances, to create dramatism, to emphasize a certain scene, building, or people. There's this clean symmetry about her images that is created precisely by the establishment of zones in the photo, some in focus, some out of focus, lines that create perspective that will in turn guide the viewer's eye through the photo. And this is one of the things I took from Berenice Abbott's photography, but there's also the importance of light. In this case, Abbott explores light in her photography, creating very interesting contrasts with many different subjects, from Jean Cocteau's hands, one of my favorite photos ever by the way, to buildings, landscape, etc. And do have in mind, these are subjects with a completely different scale, which just shows her skill and how much we can take from her photography. And this use of light goes hand in hand with the idea of activity in her photos, meaning she brings dramatism into her photos by using light at certain angles to create this illusion of constant change. It's almost like we look at her photos and we can imagine all the movement, all the city frenzy, as the light is diffused, reflected, thrown around by windows, mirrors, mixed with smoke from sewers, from the docks, and so forth. And in the 1940s and 1950s, she dedicated herself to science photography, which is a discipline that not a lot of us know about or talk about, and it's quite frankly very underground. And she always had this fascination for science, and she felt that there was this disruption, or that general audience were kind of detached from science and how it affects their lives and how important it is. And so she invested a lot into defining new things, into finding new things, and in this case she came up with new techniques, new equipment, and it's really interesting to see that someone who has had so much experience in photography and suddenly turns into what we can consider an inventor. And she invented really awesome things, let me tell you that. She worked on things such as the Abbott distorter, where the image was contoured during printing, which then created absurd distortions. She also worked on something called a superside camera, which was a camera that allowed the projection of an enlarged object onto a light-sensitive paper, which would then reduce grain, and in turn would create a much sharper image. And eventually she moved to Maine, where she had a property, and we can consider this as sort of being like the later years or a later part of her career. And then she kept photographing until she was pretty advanced in age. And she came up even with a series of photos that were about her surroundings and landscapes in Maine, which was published much later in her life. And I guess that looking at the career of someone like as accomplished as she was, it's really inspiring, because this just goes to show how many sides photography has. And a lot of us engage with the creative side. Me, personally, I engage more with the creative side than actually the technical side of photography. And I think it's interesting to conceive of all these sides of photography. Say the printing side, the aspect of creating, of putting thought into creating something, shooting, just developing new things, inventing new things, and experimenting. And I think it's really interesting to look at her and her career and think about it this way and take inspiration from this. And I think this is the main message of this video. So I hope that you took a lot from it, that you enjoyed it, that it helped in any way. And yeah, with that being said, I'll see you here for another video very soon. Take care, keep shooting film, peace.